You may occasionally hear references to the 9/11 terrorist attacks as the first time since Pearl Harbor that the United States was attacked on U.S. soil, but that isn't exactly correct. Starting in the summer following Pearl Harbor, Japan not only attacked but occupied portions of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, even capturing residents who they incarcerated in POW camps on the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Unbeknownst to many, the World War II era had profound impacts on Alaska, and in particular, Alaska natives. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brennan Rensink. This month we talk with Dr. Holly Guise about her book, Alaska Native Resilience: Voices from World War II. Building on a foundation of oral history she conducted, Guise reveals how Alaska Natives navigated wartime circumstances and spaces and pushed against or refashioned colonial structures and assertions of their sovereignty. It's a wake-up call that our Western and Indigenous narratives of the mid-20th century have exhibited some major blind spots, and Guise helps us correct them. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brennan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this podcast is a one-man operation. I'm the host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take just about any excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. Each episode features a conversation with them: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who have called it home. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends. Follow us on Facebook and X or Twitter, and send in feedback. At the end of this episode, I'll include some more information about my own scholarship and about the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Dr. Holly Guise is Assistant Professor of History at the University of New Mexico. She holds a bachelor's in Native American Studies from Stanford University and a master's and PhD in history from Yale University. She's the author of multiple book chapters and a 2022 article in the Western Historical Quarterly entitled "Who is Dr. Bauer? Rematriating a Censored Story on Internment, Wardship, and Sexual Violence in Wartime Alaska, 1941 to 1944, which won 4 different awards from the Western History Association that year. The Errol M. Gibson Award for the Best Essay of the Year on the History of Native Americans, the Jensen Miller Award for the Best Article in the Field of Women and Gender in the North American West, the Vicky L. Ruiz Award for the Best Article on Race in the North American West, and the Oscar O. Winther Award for the Best Article published in the Western Historical Quarterly, as well as an award from the Western Association of Women Historians, the Judith Lee Ridge Prize for the Best Article in the Field of History. In 2022, she received both an American Council of Learned Societies and Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship to aid her in the research that culminated in her book that we discussed this month, Alaska Native Resilience: Voices from World War II, which was published by the University of Washington Press in 2024 as a part of their Indigenous Confluences series. Featuring oral histories Guise conducted among Alaska Native elders, some of which are available on a companion website, www.alaska.com, and supplemented with extensive tribal, community, and government archival research. Alaska Native Resilience details the multiple impacts that increased U.S. military occupation and activities had on Alaska Natives, and more notably, the strategic decisions, actions, and alliances different Indigenous individuals and groups made to assert their rights and protect their communities in the midst of forced removals, coerced labor, segregation, sexual violence, and Native involvement in the militarized defense of their homelands from invasion. In each chapter, Guise focuses on how Alaska Natives pursues what she terms equilibrium restoration, or as she explains in other terms, how they, quote, fought to retain their lands and restore an Indigenous agenda amid colonial projects. In this, Guise's approach moves beyond simply acknowledging moments of Indigenous agency and explores long-term actions that shaped and adapted Indigenous sovereignty to the imposed colonial structures, and that forced those imposed worlds to bend to their Indigenous needs and perspectives. This work is markedly transparent in its methodology, and considering how complex its stories are, is replete with consistent moments of clarity. Guise's writing takes innumerable historical threads which exist in the most convoluted of colonial, international, intertribal, and other contexts, and connects them in ways that are easy for readers to follow and understand. For a book that deals with topics and geographies most will be unfamiliar with, Guise has done a remarkable job of producing a text in which readers will rarely find themselves lost or confused. Alaska Native Resilience is a valuable work, not only for opening our eyes to histories we may not have been familiar with, but as a demonstration in methodology, of conscientious conducting and use of oral histories, the linking of histories beyond the immediate generation being studied, and bringing them into conversation with the present to help strengthen communities today. Dr. Holly Guise, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Rensink. It's nice to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about this book. I've been anticipating it for a while because last year or the year before, you had an article that I think won all of the awards. And so, not to set the bar too high, but lots of anticipation for this book.
It was surprising. Yeah, that was surprising. And I jokingly told, someone in the department that I peaked. So
hopefully not. So on the podcast, we've actually done a few Alaska episodes already, but I do think it'd be worth taking a moment to kind of contextualize Native Alaskan experiences for people so they understand. I think generally listeners of the podcast understand that Alaska in many ways does line up with familiar Western tropes and narratives that we're familiar with. Colonialism, the convergence of lots of different ethnicities of peoples, resource extraction, subjugation of Native peoples, dispossession, all these things also happen in Alaska. But there's also a lot that's really unique. And so I thought maybe we could start, if you could just take a couple minutes and tell us about any key differences that you think we should be aware of so that we don't impose some of our familiar Western narratives on Native Alaskan histories that simply aren't appropriate or just don't match.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Brendan. So, the funny thing is, at some point in grad school, I almost felt like I was kind of making a case or arguing that Alaska was part of this West. And there's certainly other historians who've already done so, like Dr. Robert Campbell in Darkest Alaska. And then I think Bathsheba Demuth had a book come out, Floating Coast, on environmental history and like Siberia and the Arctic. And even Finney Dunaway had a book on environmental history come out within the past couple of years. So we certainly have this kind of cohort of Western American historians who have been talking about Alaska for a while and producing really fantastic scholarship. So I'm really happy to be engaging in this field and also to be adding Alaska to this narrative of the American West, how we shouldn't only be looking west, but we should also be looking north. And I think that that's particularly relevant when you look at the colonial history of the United States during the gold rush and continuing through the 20th century with the wars, World War II and the Cold War, but then also oil extraction, right? And so Alaska is very much part of this broader narrative. But what I like to ask my students, when I talk about Alaska or when I give some kind of talk to an audience that is less familiar, I say, show of hands, who has been to Alaska? I say that to, students down in Albuquerque or an audience here in New Mexico. And usually like one or two or three people might raise their hands. And then I ask them, did you go to Alaska because of the military, tourism, or family? And so when I ask those questions, it's really interesting because there's really only a few reasons people have visited Alaska. One of the main being military, especially here in New Mexico with the base down here and the base up in Alaska, there is that connection. And then also tourism, right? And so I think Alaska also has this similar history to Hawaii in terms of this tourist economy and well, really like an extension of colonialism, but also how tourism has infused the space, right? And then the last is family. And I hear that one less often, right? But sometimes it's because somebody has a job in Alaska and they're visiting a sibling or something like that. But it's always interesting to me to learn when people visit Alaska and why they visit Alaska from outside.
So are there things about Native Alaskan experiences, maybe specifically kind of up to this World War II era, that do not match kind of more familiar Western Native experiences?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fantastic question. So this part isn't in the book. Now I'm talking about what's not in the book, but just kind of my knowledge about Alaska history. From what I've gathered, like the Alaska gold rush is very different than the California gold rush. Like, yes, there's the cases of violence, right? The cases of settler encroachment and whatnot, the extraction of resources. Alaska is a different geography in that a lot of people can't just survive when they get there, right? Because of the Arctic conditions and the subarctic conditions, a lot of people who went up to Alaska in the 1890s really relied on Native people and Native knowledge in terms of surviving the climate, even buying cold weather gear made by Native women, which is a narrative we also see during World War II as well, right? With Native women literally outfitting the US Army. Because otherwise you just can't survive up there, right? And so Alaska is kind of this different space where in some ways Native people can kind of dictate terms more so with either settlers or the government, but then there still is this tension of a colonial power pressing upon the land and the people and extracting resources and even extracting Native labor. So I think with the book, one of the things that I also address is one of the things that is similar with Alaska is in the 1940s, you have the relocation of Unanga from the Aleutian Islands, basically over 880 Unanga, also known by the colonial term Aleut, forcibly removed from 1942 to 1944 and 1945 to 6 relocation camps in Southeast Alaska. And that's administered by the U.S. Navy and also the U.S. government. So here in the 1940s, there's a Native removal history, right? And that fits with these broader narratives of our stories of the American West and Native removals across the American West. One of the scholars that comes to mind, like right off the bat, is historian Jeffrey Osler, Surviving Genocide, right? And so he basically documents all of these Native removal histories. And so I think one of the things that my book also reminds people is we do have a continued history of Native removals, even in the mid-20th century, in places like Alaska. And with the Unanga in particular, forced labor with sealing operations. Oftentimes people think the fur trade ends, like let's just say the 18th century. I'm just throwing out a random date here, right? But with this case with Alaska, you see how there are basically fur industry operations run by the government and a private corporation of the Folk Fur Company in St. Louis, Missouri, literally extracting and stealing from Native labor. Like these Native laboring bodies are forced to harvest seal pelts for the profit of the U.S. government. And this is while Unanga are in internment or relocation camps in Southeast Alaska during the war. So there's a lot of layers here in terms of not only the removal history of Native bodies, but also forced labor as well.
That's what's fascinating. Why I always like to push my students to dip into Alaska or Hawaiian history is that there's so many things that resonate with, what maybe they're familiar with, but often it's a century later.
Yes.
And the circumstances then are very different. And so it's familiar but strange. And that's really productive ground for thinking critically, not just about, Alaskan or Hawaiian history, but then thinking more critically about more familiar Western histories. When we're, for the same reason I like to have students watch foreign Western films.
Interesting.
Because often they approach the West from very unexpected angles, but it causes us to kind of question some of our assumptions.
Yes.
I wanted to also lay some groundwork before we get fully into the book about methodology or theory. I don't do much theory on the podcast.
Okay.
But you have this framework and this phrase that it's very clear that this is your central organizing principle. This concept of what you call equilibrium restoration as a way to interpret these histories and you paint it as something that is unique and different than some more familiar concepts of indigenous agency that maybe we're more familiar with. Explain this term for us, because this is going to be what we're going to come back to time and time again as we move through a few of your chapters and topics about how you use these things to explore the emergence or the practicing of Native peoples finding what you call, again, equilibrium restoration, or pushing for equilibrium restoration.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So I'll say how I came up with this concept. So at some point, I probably interviewed, I think, over 90 elders from different Alaska Native tribal communities, and also veterans from across the state. And that was something that I started doing in 2008 when I was an undergrad, and then I basically continued as a grad student. And in connecting with Unanga elders who remembered relocation, who remembered the war years, one of the elders named Alice Petrovelli talked about a time when a BIA dentist basically not only enacted bodily harm on herself with medical testing and spinal taps and things like that when she was basically a child, like a pre-teenager, but she talks about how the BIA doctor also had sexual relations with one of the women in the camp, which is not consensual, right? In terms of physician, patient, someone who is incarcerated, and someone who is an employee of the government. Like, there's all of these ways that this is not a consensual relationship, regardless of how it could have been framed, right? But then the thing that stood out to me is she said that the doctor failed to treat her cousin who died of an appendix rupture, like a little girl. And once her cousin died at the camps, because over 10% of Unanga would die at these relocation camps from deplorable housing conditions, a lack of medical care, a lack of clean water, and also a need for food. So there's really a long list there. 10% is really high, right? Like, that's higher than most of us remember from the COVID years. And I think all of us kind of know someone from our community or our neighborhood or our families who passed away because of COVID. So 10% is really very high to put into context. And she said that when her cousin died of a ruptured appendix, her uncle, Bill Dirks, kicked out the BIA physician, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or Office of Indian Affairs. I'm just going to say BIA because that's how elders refer to it. But kicked out the BIA physician. And I thought about that, and I thought, like, even in the confines of a relocation camp or a wartime camp where you basically have Native people who are dispossessed or who are refugees, that is an action of agency or an assertion of power. And I thought, why is he doing that? Why would you decline medical aid? And I thought, he's trying to restore equilibrium. So, like, basically, I thought of this concept, if you think about, like, colonialism as kind of like waves of violence, and like perhaps colonialism is trying to take labor, land, bodies. If you think of colonialism pushing against Native people, in this instance, the equilibrium restoration comes from the uncle expelling the doctor, right? And then the equilibrium restoration also comes from Unanga advocacy to return to their home islands. And so Unanga would return to their home islands in 1944 and 1945, which they really advocate for, like, the whole time that they're at these camps. And then I thought that was a really kind of valuable framework for, like, the whole narrative of when I talk to Native elders. Like, what are the ways that Native people pushed against these, not only pushed against the colonial expectations, but actually reshaped an entire colonial project, right? And I thought they're just trying to restore equilibrium. They're just trying to bring things back. And sometimes I thought that doesn't happen immediately, like with her uncle Bill Dirks. Sometimes that takes a whole generation. And so, as another example, there's an Alutiiq elder from Kodiak, and he was banished from speaking his native languages from the Western assimilationist schools, banning him from speaking Sugpiat. And then later in life, he would become a Sugpiat language teacher for the youth. And I thought, this is equilibrium restoration. He is bringing back his native tongue that was trying to be cut out, right? And he's restoring it and bringing it back to the future generation. And so I thought equilibrium restoration was also a powerful model, not just for something you see instantly, but something that you see happen over time with, like, an entire Native community or a Native nation that is restoring itself. Because colonialism will try to degrade or take away or assimilate, but then basically Native people they don't have it. They don't take it, and they reshape these projects, and they basically reassert their own autonomy. And sometimes that takes time, but it does happen.
I think this is powerful because there's been lots of great work in Indigenous studies that is rightfully talking about Native agency. This is kind of one of the huge shifts over the last 40, 50 years in scholarship, right? But
Yeah.
even then, sometimes it is just very kind of reactive, like
Yeah.
moments of Native reaction to colonial powers or events or whatever. Your framing, though, seems to really highlight not just reactive agency, but agency that is productive, that is moving towards something, and towards something as defined by Native peoples, right? And so, and especially as you kind of take this out over multiple generations, as you were just saying, it's agency in the name of building building something, of asserting indigeneity, or even evolving what their forms of indigeneity are. As you talk about throughout the book, it's also about taking colonial structures and spaces and co-opting them and using them for their own purposes, or even forcing those structures to change to fit them.
Yes.
So it's just a much more complex way of thinking about agency. Anyways, I found that really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. And I really thought about that too, in terms of like, especially with Native people in the service during World War II, right? Like the assumption would be, oh, they're patriotic, right? But when you dig deeper, when you talk to elders about why they were in the service or why they were in a guerrilla platoon like the Alaska Territorial Guard, you learn that they're primarily trying to protect their communities from Japan's invasion, because Japan invades these Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska in the summer of 1942. And Alaska Natives really step up, right? Because this is also their home front. And so not only are they serving in the U.S. military, but they're also serving to protect their own communities and their own sovereign nations. And so after talking to elders, I really thought like Native people are just using these military structures to protect their land and to protect their peoples. And so it's kind of an assumption to think that Native people just passively accepted the aid of the U.S. military or U.S. government, but really it was a choice. And like I say choice because at this time, really historians will tell you about contingency, right? Like we talk about contingency and how anything can, change at a given point in time, right? And so if we look at the empires that are active during World War II in this Alaska kind of Arctic area, it's Japan, the Soviets, and the US, right? And so there really is a choice here in terms of who people want to ally with. And I find it really interesting that basically Alaska Natives are choosing to ally with the US government and the US military instead of Japan. And from what I gather, it's probably, in my opinion, it probably has to do with picking a more familiar colonial entity, but also the kind of horrors that was happening during the Pacific War with Japan's imperialism in other areas. I'm almost certain, like people think that Native people don't know anything, but Native people do have radios, right? And so they do know stuff that is happening across the Pacific. And so I think for Native people, they kind of saw this as a chance to build an alliance. And in some ways, it kind of is ironic because when you look at Western U.S. history, oftentimes the U.S. is not just giving guns to Natives, right? And in this case of Alaska during World War II, the U.S. military is giving World War I era Enfield rifles, so older military equipment, to the Alaska Territorial Guard to guard the coastline from Japan's invasion. So some of that could also be, like we could say, as parallel histories to Native scouts of the American West who happened to ally with the U.S. military, right? But I also think that in some ways, this is also different because Native people at this time are more or less interacting in a way that support each other and they're not battling each other, right? Like a divisive kind of colonial divide and conquer tactic is
like
not
with the
quite
scouting
happening.
example.
Yep, with the scouting example.
Yes.
That's not quite happening in Alaska. And certainly if we go back further, there are those histories, right? Like I think I even mentioned, in chapter 2 that Tlingit and Unanga would build an alliance together. And that's interesting too, because if you look at the history of the Battle of Sitka in like the early, I want to say 19th century, like with kind of Russian colonialism in Alaska, basically Russians have enslaved Unanga who are battling with the Tlingit in Southeast Alaska. So it's really only a few generations prior that Unanga and Tlingit are not necessarily on the same side, right? Or that they're battling or that there's things happening. And then take us to World War II. And then basically what's fascinating to me is the US government just relocates an entire Native population and does not consult with the local Native tribe, right? This is Tlingit land that Unanga are put on. And there is no consultation with Unanga about their removal, and there's no consultation with Tlingit about their removal to that spot, right? And so I find this stuff really fascinating too, that it's all very happenstance. It's not very diplomatic, right? It's far from diplomatic. And that basically Native people find a way to make their own diplomacy and to forge their own, I'm borrowing from Gerald Visner here, survivance alliance, right? So Gerald Visner, Native American literary scholar, comes up with this term survivance. And then I'm piggybacking off of that term to say it's a survivance alliance when the two Native nations are helping each other survive. So yeah, that's another thing I kind of wanted to address with the book too. And I also think that it appends the assumption that Native people are always warring with each other. Because that's another thing I get tired of watching Hollywood movies, right? That Native people are always fighting each other, that they don't support each other. And so I'm saying here is a time during World War II in the 1940s when, against the odds of what people would expect, the Native people are providing aid to each other and helping each other with tribal mutual aid. And I think that that's a really powerful narrative that we need to say about Native American history too.
There's so much contingency in all of this. They didn't have to cooperate, right? They could have. Some of them were intermarried with Japanese, which actually leads to issues because some of those Japanese men are interned at Minidoka in Idaho, but their Native wives are not allowed to join. But then at the same time, Japan actually also takes some POWs. They all have lots of Russian ties. Lots of them are Russian Orthodox from the history of Russian colonialism. I mean, so the assumption that, like, of course, they were going to choose to go with the United States, or it's all so messy, and it could have gone so many different ways. Let's talk a little bit about these moments of removal, and you've already hinted at a few of them, of these Unanga who are taken out of the Aleutian Islands and their homelands and interned in Southeast Alaska. You write that some of their experiences and then the ways in which they are kind of asserting their agency and trying to direct their experience was determined by whether or not there was forced labor involved or not. Talk to us about those who were who were put into forced labor, maybe versus those who weren't.
Yeah, good question about Native people and forced labor. So what's interesting is with the Aleutian Islands and with Native removal in the 1940s, Unanga from the Aleutian Islands are removed by the U.S. Navy, and also the Pribilof Islands, which are two islands kind of just north of the Aleutian chain, and they're fur sealing islands. And so one of the terms I use in my book, and which is also in the National Archives, with like the research papers, are the Pribilobians. So Pribilobians are Unanga who are from the Pribilof fur sealing islands. And that is a legacy of forced labor by Russian colonization and also by U.S. colonization, like after Alaska's so-called purchase in 1867, right? So basically the U.S. continues the fur sealing operations on those islands. And during the 1940s, the Fish and Wildlife Service from the U.S. government would oversee these sealing operations. And that is always interesting to me because usually we see the Fish and Wildlife Service as kind of like a feel-good branch of the government, right? But in this case, they're actually part of this system that is exploiting Native labor and exploiting Native bodies, right? And the documentation of this is so severe that there's a level of surveillance on Pribilobian bodies in terms of where they are traveling to, who they are marrying, if they get divorced, that the government is saying they cannot return to their home islands. Things are very complicated, right? In terms of this amount of surveillance, pressure, and profit that comes from these Native bodies. And I can't remember the exact, dollar amount, but we're talking about millions of dollars worth of labor here, like especially over several decades and over, I would say over 100 years, right? So like from 1867 to basically the 1970s, when Unanga from the Pribilof Islands basically organized but also formed native corporations. That's when things kind of more or less end in terms of the government oversight. But yeah, the labor is so severe that in the summer of 1943, when the Aleutian Islands are still considered an active war zone, because basically we have Japan's invasion in the summer of 1942, and then the Battle of Attu in the spring of 1943. Nonetheless, like with this reclaiming by US and Canadian forces to reclaim the Aleutian Islands, nonetheless, in the summer of 1943, when the Aleutians are still an active war zone, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service takes Unanga men who are from the Pribilof Islands from their families at these relocation camps, these internment camps.
So they've already been removed.
They've already been removed. Brings them back to the
Yeah.
Pribilof Islands to harvest seal pelts for the profit of the U.S. government, right? And so that part is interesting to me as well, that you have family separations, but also multiple removals. And during this time, Pribilobian men are advocating for increased pay, especially because it's an active wartime. And some of them are even saying, we won't go back unless our families can come back too. And then basically there are letters from the federal archives that basically say, like someone from the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service says, tell any men who won't go back that they can never return to their home islands again. Right. And so there's this level of control of Native bodies on their own lands and their own seals and their own labor that is just so exponential. Right. And I really felt like, even though this is like a history of like all Alaska Natives during World War II, there's a deep gravity to this kind of forced labor history that I think a lot of people should know about, especially because it continued. There's people alive today who were part of those forced sealing operations. Right. Like it's really not that long ago.
And so while some of these men are protesting and arguing, for their families to join for higher pay, because they're making just fractions of percents of the actual profits that are being made from the sale of these seal pelts, how are their families or others who remain at the internment camps in Southeast Alaska? How are they resisting or pushing for to find equilibrium, to restore that?
So how are the families faring who are left behind? Usually the women, elders, and children. And of the 10% of Unanga who passed away, most were very young children and elders. And so there's basically kind of generational gaps in terms of who is surviving these conditions. And then what's also interesting is, in addition to that removal to Southeast Alaska, there's concentric removals with Pribilobian men who are taken back for the sealing operations, but then also Native children of a certain school age are taken to the boarding school. So basically, if you have older Native children, they are taken to the boarding school, usually at the Wrangell Institute or one of the schools in Southeast Alaska. And so there's really just several ways that these Native families are being separated at this time. And while the Native boarding school is assimilative and it's oppressive, what's interesting is several elders who I talked to, because of the hardships of war, actually found the boarding school to be a place where you had steady meals, right? And a place where you had a warm bed. And so I also find it really interesting that the conditions of the war are almost so oppressive that even just like a baseline of food and shelter is like a step up from the conditions that are happening at the ground level, right? And that also comes from even Tlingit elders who had issues within their own home lives, I would say, because of this onslaught of colonialism kind of really disrupting Native families and like Native societies during this time period. And so one of the other elders I talked to, Carol Feller Brady, who's Tlingit, talked about how basically the boarding school saved her life, because before then she was an orphan and she was basically a child slave. And so there's really like a lot to unpack. And I really think a lot of this, it can only really be done by talking to the people who experienced it, and it's different than just the letter from the archive. And we're still increasing Native presence in the archives, right? But I think the oral history has also really helped to kind of bridge our understanding about the perspectives of Native peoples during this time.
Yeah, the kind of things that will be shared in an oral history are a lot different than some government document or even like a personal letter that ends up in an archive. Very, very different. But so you see them sometimes choosing to send their kids to boarding schools because that's, which seems counter to us. That seems like something that most Native people would resist. But that additional removal and family separation in the name of it being better conditions for the kids, that's surprising.
It really varies. It is surprising. And it really varies by family because for Carol Brady, she was an orphan. And so I think that the parents couldn't really give consent to that, right? And then the other example I can think of is there's a Tlingit poet and literary scholar named Nora Dowenhauer. And I talked to Nora Dowenhauer and she told me a different story. And the story is basically that her father refused to let her go to the Western schools. And so they just kept moving around Southeast Alaska. So the government could not pin this family down. And so when she eventually got, if I'm remembering this correctly, she got her GED and she would eventually get a college degree. She did that on her own terms as an adult, right? And so there's also the stories of like Native resistance and family resistance in terms of opposing the assimilation education, in this case, by moving around so much they couldn't be pinned down.
One detour that we probably shouldn't take, but I think would fascinate people, is that in this era of removal, Native peoples are removed, but whites are not.
Yes. Yep. So it is race-based. It is a race-based removal. If I'm remembering this correctly, it's Commander Updegraff, I think that's the name of the individual, basically said all natives over 1/4 blood quantum are compelled to go to the relocation camps. So it does include this colonial concept of blood quantum in terms of who is, by the government standard, native enough to be removed. And then white men are considered autonomous enough to remain in the Aleutian Islands and to defend the Aleutian Islands should Japan keep invading. But Native people are perceived as almost like children or like wards of the state. A lot of the language is in the Federal Archive talks about protecting the Native people, but a big part of this is also protecting the Native laboring bodies, right? In terms of these are the bodies from the Pribilof Islands that are bringing profit to the government. And so like if something happens to the Pribilof Islands, then basically that whole industry is out, right? And so there is an economic component to it as well, in addition to this patriarchal kind of concept of Native people as like wards to the government, right?
But it's even more complicated though, isn't it? Because on the one hand, so for the natives from the Pribilof Islands, they valued their bodies for their labor that they could provide, right? And you talk about examples of them not allowing Native men to enlist in the military because they said, actually, we would like them to be doing the sealing operations or other things. On the other hand, in certain instances, the military is entirely dependent on Native labor in the context of the military, right? Through the Alaska Territorial Guard or even integration into into the Army and Navy and others. So it seems that the government, in a way, they wanted it both ways, and in some cases, right? But either way, I guess they wanted Native labor. They just weren't consistent in how they wanted Native labor or Native bodies deployed to the U.S.'s, advantage.
Yes, and that's a good point. So you're right in that at this time, like in Southeast Alaska, when Unanga are relocated, some try to enlist, right? Or some are even drafted. And then basically the Fish and Wildlife Service, the agents from there step in and say their bodies are more valuable with the profits of the sealing operations during the war than they would be in the military, right? And it's also kind of just mind-boggling too, because there are Native men who are in the service, like stationed within Alaska at the bases, but then even the Aleutian Islands, like with the Battle of Attu, the first kind of boat to land to begin this Battle of Attu is Native men, Unanga, Aleut men from the Aleutian Islands, right? Reclaiming their homeland using the U.S. military. See, that I can't tell you if they were enlisted or drafted. I wish I could tell you the exact.
but they were doing so like as part of the military. They were doing so as part of the military operation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So they were doing so as part of the military operations. And what you're getting at is, I think, like this differentiation between Unanga from the Aleutian Islands and Unanga from the Pribilofs. Basically, the Pribilof Islands, which are the sealing operations, they have a different narrative in terms of government control and government kind of oversight, so severe that at the National Archives, when you look at the stories of Aleut relocation or evacuation, like this is what the terminology is, you have documents upon documents about the Pribilobians, but very scant documents about the Unanga from the Aleutian Islands. And it's because their bodies were not seen as profitable or valuable, right? And so to the point where when you look at Pribilobian records with the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's a daily log talking about the number of people who are sick, which means a government agent went into this abandoned cannery, counted the number of people who were sick, and wrote it down, because that's how valuable their labor is. Whereas Alice Petrovelli, an elder who was at the relocation camp in Killisnoo, I could hardly find any records about Killisnoo, right? And it's because there was no oversight, and because a lot of times the Unanga from the Aleutian Islands were almost thought of as afterthoughts, right? And so the perspective that I have about these relocation camps come from these oral testimonies of people who remembered what the conditions were like, and the people who helped them, who were the Tlingit.
Let's maybe stay on this topic of race, and we're going to jump kind of towards to the end of the book, and we'll jump backwards and get back to some of the earlier chapters. But you have this, there's really this play on words in one of your latter chapter titles of racing and erasing natives, right? This tension between what you call, I think others have called it as well, frozen and Jim Crow, segregation and stuff up in Alaska in the north, and the tension with assimilation. So on the one hand, they're making the decisions based on blood quantum. They are racializing Native peoples in often in gendered ways, talking about Native women in very specific ways, and wanting to keep the races separated, while at the same time pursuing assimilation programs, especially with Native youth and stuff in boarding schools, and trying to make them become white, but at the same time trying to prevent intermarriage or interracial dating. It's really, really complicated.
It's very perplexing. Yes. That's the part. The funny thing about being a historian is we have to interpret things, right? So we come across all this evidence and then we put it together and we're like, what does it all mean? And when I put the pieces together, I'm like, how can you try to assimilate Native people and say that they're savage and that they need to customize themselves to Westernization, to speak English, to dress Western, right? But then how do you segregate them publicly? Because segregation is the opposite of assimilation, right? And so to me, I really couldn't wrap my head around that. And so I thought that this is almost it's like a perplex of colonialism or settler colonialism, where you don't really know what to do with the Native people. And so you're part of this project of assimilation because that's probably easier to establish settlements and whatnot. But to then segregation because of, I'm just going to say, these legacies of, white supremacy that were deeply ingrained in the U.S. government. And for anybody who says it wasn't, just look at 1920s eugenics history with the U.S. government, right? There's really kind of a long history of government projects in the 19th and early 20th century that basically involve subjugating certain minority groups. And in this particular example, Alaska and Native people, right? And so what's also interesting about Alaska is Alaska does have this boarding school history, like American Indians, from the continental mainland, and also this assimilationist education and these boarding schools that are run by the federal government. And so in talking to Native people, they didn't like the boarding schools, right? They don't like the assimilation. They're trying to bring Native languages back in their older age. But then what's also interesting is, especially about the 1940s, before the passage of the Alaska Equal Rights Act, Native people are segregated in movie theaters, restaurants. There's really a lot of oral testimony about feelings of discrimination from these businesses and other places. And so for me, when I looked at what Native people are doing to respond to this, not only are they advocating for equality, right, with like Elizabeth Peradovich, who's a Tlingit activist and an advocate from the Alaska Native Sisterhood, which shows Native people are organized in Southeast, right? They're demanding their rights, but Native people are also demanding their land rights. And I think that that's something that's also kind of lost in this broader narrative about equal rights and Native people wanting equal rights. They're actually advocating not just for equal rights, but Native land rights as well. So I think like with this racing and erasing chapter, I was trying to kind of push against this common narrative if we hear, probably more so in the state of Alaska, that Native people are just trying to end segregation. And what I'm trying to say is they want it all. They want to be treated equal and they want their land, right? And so I also see that as something to kind of reframe how we think about the 40s and what Native people are doing with their activism.
I think it also reframes how we talk about the broader or how I might teach the broader civil rights era, right? Where often it's African-American focused civil rights movements. And then in the 60s and 70s, we talk about Red Power. Mm-hmm. But here we have the Alaskan Native Brotherhood and Alaskan Native Sisterhood and other groups pushing for their civil rights. Well, not just in the 1940s, but even a little bit earlier.
Right.
But resulting, as you said, the Alaska Equal Rights Act in 1945, like 2 decades before the National Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And this is all because of indigenous activism and organizing, right?
Right. Native activism and Native organizing. And in looking at the letters of Native activists like the Peradoviches, Elizabeth Peradovich and Roy Peradovich, these archival collections are at the tribally run Walter Soboleff building, the Sea-Alaska Heritage Institute in Juneau. They're really framing their equality in terms of also leveraging their involvement in the military. So they're using these arguments against global fascism, kind of like to reshape this argument for why Native people should be treated equal. So they're really kind of very clever in terms of making their cases to the Alaska governor, Governor Greening. And Governor Greening is on board with that. But where I draw the line, where you see at one point in the book, Governor Greening is on board with Native people receiving equal rights. He is not on board with them receiving land rights. So you can also see, like, depending on which colonial official is in charge, they're okay with some things and not okay with other things. Whereas there's others, like I think even, if I'm remembering this correctly, like I think even John Collier is kind of privy to some of the conversations about Alaska and how Native people are trying to advocate for their land rights as well, right? So there's the odd thing about like looking at the archives is you end up with just like this giant collection of like various colonial officials and also Native activists, right? And there's almost like this push and pull between all of these different people, right? And then at some point it kind of shakes out. And the shakeout is basically the 1945 Alaska Equal Rights Act would pass. And it did not pass in 1943, right? And so I say that basically it's because of Native activism that it eventually passes in 1945. Native people mobilize, they organize each other, they start voting certain people out of office and voting other people into office. And yeah, I mean, it's all very relevant in terms of our discussion about voting, but also organizing and also, I would just say like grassroots movement in the Native community, right?
And in fascinating ways, as you know, like using the colonial structure, so using the participation in the military or their veteran status or their current, enlistment status or using these imposed structures and working within them in very strategic and surprising ways. Again, it pushes against that depiction of Native agency as simply reactionary,
right?
But as maybe more kind of long-term and strategic. Let's talk about the presence of the military. This is, of course, throughout the book. You talk about some ways in which there's already long histories of gendered violence between Native and non-Native peoples in Alaska from, Russian occupation. And I will note, as I think you already hinted to, like that Russian history, it's some of the roughest stuff I've come across anywhere. Like the really horrible ways in which they, of forced labor, gendered violence. It's really, really rough stuff. But unfortunately, there are versions of that continue.
Yeah.
You write about ways in which the military presence augmented that a little bit and kind of changed the contours of how Native peoples were trying to protect their women from violence, but simultaneously empower their women to make their own decisions about who they want to associate with. So how does the presence of the military kind of factor into these gendered worlds?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So basically, the presence of the military in Alaska from World War II just fundamentally changes Alaska, right? In terms of Alaska becoming a highly militarized space, but also a space that was invaded, a space that becomes defended. And like really this legacy of military in Alaska, it doesn't end because it would continue for decades into the Cold War, right? But for this book, I wanted to look specifically at like World War II and based off of oral histories from Native women talking about the time period. And then things that I uncovered in the archives, I was trying to answer this question of like, what is the story of sexual violence and war in Alaska? And so in some ways, it was definitely one of the harder chapters to write. And what I would say is also interesting is when I first set out to kind of write this work or to work on what was my dissertation that became this book, that was actually the first chapter I wrote. And so the first chapter I wrote, I really wanted to ground our understanding of Alaska with like this sexual violence and the objectification of Native women's bodies. And like basically how sexual violence is part of this colonial project or the settler colonial project. In a lot of ways to control Native women, to control Native women's bodies, and basically to, in a lot of ways, take or degrade Native women's bodies, right? And so I have the oral histories in there, but it's also complicated in that at this time, because of these military ordinances that segregate Native women's bodies almost like a racial boundary.
Because they outlawed interracial dating between specifically Native women and servicemen, sometimes even Native servicemen.
Yes.
Which was surprising. So, but it is mostly racial. But the segregation that they cannot interact, which on the face of it, if we're thinking about violence against Native women, we might think, and this is how they talk about it, we're trying to protect Native women. We're like, that's good and positive, right? But at the same time, they're talking about the Native women primarily as like the bearers of venereal diseases.
Yes.
And so they're publicly denigrating them.
Yes.
While also protecting.
Very
you don't have
perplexing.
Any easy stories here, do you? It's all so messy.
It's so messy. Brendan, you bring up the exact point. It's so perplexing. Like, how can you talk about protecting Native women from soldiers? So that's why there's a ban on interracial dating or interracial marriages. But then at the same time, Native women become scapegoated as like carrying venereal disease. And then Native people don't like that. So they write letters and they protest and they find colonial officials who side with them. And then they eventually work with the U.S. Territorial Department of Health. And then the Department of Health steps in and says, stop blaming Native women. They don't have anything to do with the venereal diseases, right? And so it's also fascinating to me that like Native people who are kind of savvy political activists are getting so many people involved in the government that basically other people are siding with the Native people and saying, leave them alone or let them do what they want to do or stop segregating Native women. Because again, circling back to your earlier question about the 1945 Alaska Equal Rights Act, this kind of segregation against Native women's bodies would continue into the later 40s, is what I found in some of the documents. Like Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was head of the Alaska Defense Command, would basically allow any kind of official in the military to determine whether they allowed interracial dating or not. And so in some parts of Alaska, like in northern Alaska, the elders I talked to, nobody really cared, right? Inupiat, that's my family background. If they want to intermarry with servicemen who are coming in, fine, right? And there's kind of no oversight of that. Same with Athabascans in interior Alaska. So Dene or Athabascans, like there's no oversight. If the civilian women want to intermarry with military, so be it, who cares, right? But then in Southeast Alaska, for whatever reason, whichever colonial official or military official was in charge, they did not like it. And basically, Native women in Southeast Alaska, Tlingit in particular, would be banned from associating with servicemen, including other Native servicemen, right? And so this is also, I would say, a project of the military trying to control not only civilian populations, but also their own soldiers, right? And then what I find with the oral histories is that they can't force compliance. These military officials who try to create this segregation between the civilians and the servicemen and Native women and servicemen, Native women and servicemen do it anyway. They find ways to date. They find ways to go to dances together. They find ways to marry, right? But among those stories, like, I don't want to just paint a rosy picture here. There are also the stories of sexual violence as well. Like, I think Rosa Miller, who is a Tlingit elder, talks about how a group of soldiers tried to disappear her into the woods in Juneau. And she screamed so loud until a military police came along and basically separated these men from her. And then she went on her way, right? And so, yeah, there are the stories of fear as well. And there's the kind of darker stories as well, too, that I write about.
But some unexpected, like, things happen. I mean, you talk about how this ends up, I think you called it Native Women's Networks of Solidarity. Mm-hmm. And so in the face of this, they start to collaborate, and this has long-term impacts of building kind of these female networks that might later go on for all kinds of political activism. The weirdest, or the one that I just didn't expect, was seeing Native men, Native political activists, men, arguing against this prohibition of their women. Okay, that doesn't sound good because they don't own them, but of Native women from their communities intermarrying or dating white men, which I would assume, well, the Native guys are going to be, maybe they would appreciate that segregation, but no, but because it's wrapped up in this denigration of Native women, they're like, no, that's not right.
The original wife guys, if you will,
yeah,
willing to go to bat for the women in their family. Like, it's really powerful seeing that Native men would not stand for it, and they did not like Native women being denigrated, right? And so they wrote letters, they protested, they didn't like that Native women were characterized as venereal, or even, I'm going to use the quotes here, loose, right? I find it really amazing that there were these networks of Native women supporting each other, warning each other, but then also Native men really coming to bat to support Native women. And I think that that's a really cool story too. I'm glad you said that.
You already mentioned Native women. I think you mentioned it. You mentioned in the context of how on the Alaskan quote unquote frontier, non-natives are more dependent on Native peoples because of the extremes of the environment. And you mentioned how Native women would make and then sell, this survival gear, right? Which you talk about in a couple of your chapters about Native involvement in the military. And so the women are involved in that way. How are the men involved? And maybe specifically we could focus on the northern example of the Alaskan Territorial Guard, which ends up becoming a much more indigenized space in the military than the military had originally planned. So how does that evolve in the North, and how does Native men's involvement up there lead to this indigenization of these military units?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Alaska Territorial Guard forms in the 1940s, and it's in response to World War II. And one of the kind of organizers named Major Marvin Marston, maybe it's General Major Marvin Marston, he basically decides to go to Alaska. He's a World War I veteran. He goes to Alaska and he tries to kind of put together these guerrilla platoons. And initially he puts kind of like white men in charge, and it just does not take off. And then at some point he kind of,
and is this all the way north, like Nome?
Yes.
And along
like Nome, Barrow, like Alaska's North Slope. We're talking about the Arctic, not the subarctic. And then once he really kind of works with the Native nations and with the Native leaders of these Inupiat and Yupik towns, traveling by dog sled, right, to these different places. Once Native people organize themselves and decide to work with Muktuk Marston, that's when the Alaska Territorial Guard is more or less formalized. And I say more or less because there are Alaska Territorial Guard members in other parts of Alaska, but a big majority of these ATG members are from Native communities and coastal communities. So as a random example, again, the caveat or something, one of the elders who I interviewed who is from Palmer is Finnish American by background, so non-Native. And they were raised in the Palmer Colony, which is a colony of like white settlers from the Midwest brought to Alaska to kind of become farmers. And there's an ATG in Palmer, and he's part of that, right? So there are white people who are in the ATG, but overwhelmingly, a big majority of these ATGs are Native people, right, on coastal Alaska. And the stories that I find is that Muktuk Marston, he gets this name because he eats as much muktuk, which is like whale blubber, as Native people. And Native people find this very endearing because muktuk is considered kind of like a gamey food that a lot of Western men will not eat, right? Or that they don't like or that they're not used to. And so I think Native people were just kind of amused by this military guy going up to Northern Alaska, rolling out a reindeer skin, staying at anybody's house who would host him, kind of jovial, good in nature. And I think Native people really liked him. And they still talked about him like they really liked him, right? Even the veterans who I interviewed. And what I found was even in looking at Muktuk Marston's autobiography, excuse me, I find examples where he has to work with Native women in order for the ATG to organize. So at some point he goes to Teller and he brings a bottle of perfume, like a Western gift, to a medicine woman. He doesn't, I can't remember her name, but he brings a bottle of perfume to her to gain her favor to try to establish this ATG. And that also tells me that like Native women have a lot more power than we had considered. The fact that this military man from the military has to work with a Native woman who's a medicine woman, a shaman, right, in this Native village to try to gain permission for an ATG to form. And it's up to her to decide whether it forms or not. Like, I think that actually shows a lot of Native women's power that's been almost like hidden or that we haven't really uncovered, right? And another thing that I found is in the roster for the Kotzebue area, the ATG had a number of Native women's names. And if I'm remembering this correctly, it's something like 40% of the names are women's names. And in other parts of Alaska, Native women were not allowed to list their name on the roster because the US military did not want women involved in the ATG. But I think it's just so interesting. And that makes me question if 40% of the ATG involvement were women in Kotzebue, there were probably Native women involved in other places as well, just not listed on the roster, right? And there's even cases where Native women are taken off the roster when they had been an ATG sergeant. But basically, the military finds out that M. Penegu stands for Maggie and it's not a man's name, and then they're removed, right? So whether or not Maggie Penegu actually stops her involvement is another issue, but she is taken off the roster at some point by the military. So yeah, that's a good question. Like, not only are Native women kind of making this cold weather gear, they have contracts with the US Army and they're profiting from it, and they're part of this sustainable fur in Northern Alaska, right? These kind of sustainable fashions and profiting from it. But then we also have Native women who are actually defending their homeland too. And I find that to be really similar to other stories across the Pacific, like Filipino women who are part of the guerrilla platoons and stuff like that, right? So I try to make some of those parallels too. Like, it's not just Alaska, there's other parts of the Pacific where women are really stepping up.
And this also speaks again to that, what you mentioned earlier, of the extreme nature of the place puts Native peoples in a very different position of power, and a position where the U.S. presence has to really depend on them, or, show up, go to this medicine woman and bring her a gift and engage in indigenous practices of diplomacy, not Western practices of diplomacy and relationships, right? Where the playing field is more indigenous defined, or I don't know how to exactly say that, but we don't see that necessarily across other places in the West. So that's really unique. We need to kind of wrap up. I like to sometimes end these by trying to understand how, as Westerners, we might take this specific story and export it to apply to more broad kind of Western things going on, either historically or today. And so as I was kind of trying to think about what here might be exportable more broadly for Native America, or even just for the West more broadly, I was really intrigued in your epilogue by this practice you mentioned of talking circles, kind of as a methodology or a practice to build community, to process the legacies of colonialism or the ongoing colonial things still ongoing. to link generations,
Mm-hmm.
to move forward towards restoring equilibrium, especially as elders are passing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us, give us like what are these talking circles? Because maybe that's something that all of us more broadly, even in our even non-natives, like in our own families and communities, like, is this a practice that maybe we could learn from?
Yeah, I really like that question. So, in response to what is the talking circle, there's a Yupik philosopher named Harold Napoleon, and he wrote this really great book called Uyarak. And I think a lot of Alaskans or Alaska Natives know this little book. It's like maybe only 35 pages. And he wrote it when he was formerly incarcerated, if I'm remembering this correctly. And he was really trying to understand the colonial condition of Alaska and like how colonialism had brought violence to Native people broadly, but then also to his own life. And so one of the things he talks about is the Great Death, which is basically colonialism kind of bringing death, like not only from epidemics and diseases, but then also just, again, we could even interpret this as through boarding school separations, things like that, right? Like where you have families that are fractured because there are people missing because of deaths or because of removals, like boarding schools and things like that. And one of the things he proposes to kind of overcome this trauma and the Great Death is talking circles. And so I found it really compelling that of a lot of the elders who I talked to who remembered the war and who had these experiences, in their later lives, they would also be part of or facilitate talking circles and healing groups for other people in their communities. Like if I'm remembering this correctly, Carol Feller Brady would frequently give talks with people who are incarcerated in Juneau, like women. And she even received like a Service to Humanity award from one of the local church groups. So really, a lot of these elders are involved in various capacities of giving back, but also listening and talking and rebuilding community. And so I was trying to zoom out and think like, is there a way that we can kind of highlight like what Harold Napoleon is saying, like with this colonialism, and if there's a solution, right? And so I'm trying to offer like maybe we need to start talking to each other and listening to each other. And I thought that was kind of a good way to bridge like why oral history is important. You know, like it's not just talking to someone to record it or to archive it or to write about it. But I do like to think that with the oral history, hopefully there's like some healing there as well too, either for the person who is sharing or even in my case, the interviewer. Like I'm Alaska Native, I'm Inupiat, my family comes from Unalakleet. And there is something really healing about talking to an elder who survived this time period, who witnessed a lot of things, but who's willing to share and willing to talk about it, right? And so I kind of feel compelled also to, I don't know if the word is pay it forward or something, but to kind of keep this momentum going of how we talk to each other thoughtfully and how we, maybe I should have said listen to each other. If I could change the book now, maybe I'll
Listening
talk more
circles?
about listening. Yes.
But either way, it really transforms either be it community conversations or oral histories from potentially, from a scholarly perspective, being an extractive practice, which is problematic. We're using oral histories just to extract information so we can write our books, versus conducting oral histories and then, especially if they're then made available to the community, or hosting conversations of talking and listening in a community as a way to heal, as a way to strengthen the community and not just extract, information out of it.
Yes.
Well, Holly, congratulations on this book. It's really great. Congratulations on the past awards. Maybe I'm sure there'll be some future ones as well, but this is really great work. And I really, I'm always just wanting to champion peoples who are bringing things on the periphery, in this case, like a literal geographic periphery, into our understanding of the American West. But also, Alaskan Natives are often left out of broader discussions of Indigenous peoples in North America, and bringing them in. All of this, Alaska and Native peoples, are fully left off the map of World War II histories often, except maybe for a little footnote, right? And so your work in many ways is bringing these stories into more familiar mainstream venues, and I think that's really powerful. So thank you for that, and congratulations. This is great work.
Thank you, Dr. Brenda Rensing. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for spending a few moments with us, and hopefully we'll see you soon at a conference somewhere.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on X or Twitter at Writing West. There you can get updates and leave comments and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic and public research and promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As you know by now, my name is Brendan Rensing, and since I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, you can direct praise or critique my work. As a historian, I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and other topics. My most prominent publications include a 2018 book, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled Histories of the North American West. So send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about that project, the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu or follow me on X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well.